Welcome, everybody, to our COP30 discussion event on adapting to a world with 1.5 plus degrees of warming. My name's Joseph Lewis, Head of Policy at the IES, and I'll be hosting today's discussion. The event is part of the IES's Road to COP30 online event series, which will bring together environmental professionals to discuss key themes on the climate agenda and priorities for action. Indeed, it is already bringing together environmental professionals to do those two things. COP30, as you will be aware, is taking place in Belém, Brazil, from the 10th to the 21st of November. Ahead of the conference, the IES is holding 4 themed discussion events. This is the third of those discussions and will be followed by an event on turning ambitions into action and/or delivering solutions, which is next week. And details of that final discussion can be found on the IES website. The event today will focus on the current state of climate adaptation and the increased urgency of resilience as we face the likelihood of a world beyond 1.5 degrees. Indeed, more than a likelihood at this point. Regardless of the pace of climate mitigation, adaptation is essential, so COP30 must work to support worldwide resilience. Despite that, and even though we've seen a significant increase in attention for the adaptation agenda at recent climate COPs, climate adaptation remains underfunded and under-recognized. With the prospect of a world beyond 1.5 degrees looking increasingly likely, there's a large yet surmountable challenge ahead of us, so today's discussion will give us a chance to reflect on how we can move that agenda forward. We are delighted today to have 4 speakers joining us who will start us off with presentations from each of their perspectives. We'll then have some time for questions before moving into a slightly more interactive part of the discussion, opening things up to the group to give all of you the chance to share your perspectives around the theme if you want to. We'll be keeping the panel as part of that discussion, allowing the discussion to flow naturally back and forth and drawing on all the expertise that we've got gathered here. Before COP30, all of the outcomes from these 4 discussions will be brought together in a position piece, which will then be used to brief the IES delegate attending COP30 and to identify what environmental scientists think are the most important priorities for the coming months. So we'll be beginning today with Kripa Dwarakanath. Kripa has more than 20 years of experience in sustainability consulting and advisory roles and leads GHD's Europe and Middle East Sustainability and Resilience Service line in the UK. Her team works with businesses and public sector infrastructure organisations providing sustainability advisory services, including around nature-based solutions, decarbonisation and climate mitigation and adaptation. After Kripa, our next speaker will be Dr. Shan Sheng. Shan leads the Air and Climate Service at Ramboll UK. With over 30 years of experience, her expertise spans climate adaptation, sustainability, carbon, and air quality management across major infrastructure projects, urban developments, and corporate organisations. She's a fellow of the IAQM, the Institute of Air Quality Management, a chartered engineer, and a chartered physicist. Following Shan, our third speaker will be Denise Adayibo Okpala. Denise is a chartered scientist, a chartered marine scientist. She's worked with the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, for over 13 years on a variety of projects, including the West African Biodiversity and Climate Change Project and the Agro-Hydro Meteorological Committee, where she worked on policymaking. Denise is an expert reviewer of the IPCC and I believe was recently announced as a lead author for Chapter 2 of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, Second Global Assessment Report. Denise is also a trustee of the IES and sits on our External Policy Advisory Committee. And then our final speaker will be Craig Love. Craig is a Director of Impact Assessment and Environment at the Scottish National Investment Bank. He's an internationally recognised climate change mitigation and adaptation practitioner, experienced in delivering sustainability across the public, private and transport infrastructure sectors. Craig's also a member of our External Policy Advisory Committee. He's a fellow of the IES and was a contributor to our work ahead of COP26, including our panel discussion on adaptation for that series of events. So he's giving us a through line to that piece of work just by being here. With all of that said, thank you for signing in. We'll get started straight away with our first presentation from Kripa. So Kripa, over to you.
Thank you. Well, as just was introduced, so I'm Kripa Dwarakanath. I lead the Sustainability and Resilience Advisory Service at GHD, and I'm also been with IES for nearly 15 plus years now, and as a chartered environmentalist and also part of the climate steering committee at the group at IES. Really pleased to be here, and we were. The type of work that we normally do is GHG quantification, greenhouse gas quantification, decarbonization strategies, climate risk assessments, or disclosures, predominantly working with businesses or organizations, or sometimes at the national level as well. Recently, I was an author for the biennial transparency report for the UAE. And also, my team, we do nature-based solutions as well, but again at a network level, more at a country level assets type activity. My talk over this 10 minutes, how I was reflecting was to give an overview. I'm sure the speakers after me have more experience and more interest in this area. They might be able to add more information, but I'm saying it more from a perspective of, okay, this is what is the status at this point in time, but also looking at through from a climate adaptation opportunity, not just challenges, and leave you with a few ideas, and hopefully as part of the panel discussion we'll pick up some of those topics as well. As the figure on the top right is from the UK Climate Change Committee, and the graph shows from various data sets, but what it essentially shows is the various data sets used for climate projections. They all tell about the same story, which is that the climate warming is happening, and they all concur with the same thing. So I'm not going to get into that detail, but what it is according to the World Climate Research Program, at a 1.5 degree scenario, sea level rise will occur by at least 0.5 meters, but that's an average. But the range is between 0.4 meters to 1 meter, depending on where you are, by the end of the century. This means frequent coastal flooding, more high tides, potentially overtopping of coastal defenses and such. That probably is good for now, but maybe not for the future. When I say future, it could be the immediate future as well. So this sea level rise combined with heavy rainfall, of course, it will result in compound hazards and flood risks at various locations globally. And what we thought could be a rare occurrence, like a flooding or any other event as a rare occurrence, it could become a chronic hazard in some areas. So that is the position, or that is the status, a brief, if you like, from the World Climate Research Program. 1 billion people will be affected globally. Is what that says. But the top thing to understand or to cast your eye on is the 20-year average warming for the year 2015 to 2034 is dubbed at 1.44. So we're kind of like almost reaching there, not even past a quarter of the century here. And that is something to bear in mind, because for brief spells we could have frequent climate hazards happening. In terms of just further information, World Met Organization figures, just reading them out here, long-term warming average for the overall decades, that remains below 1.5, but Arctic warming predicted, that continues to outstrip global average. Precipitation patterns will change. That will have bigger regional variations. For example, temporary exceedances of warming levels, it will increase at a frequency as rise in global temperature approaches between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Sea level rise or sea ice concentration predicted to reduce. We're talking about the seas in the Arctic Circle or Arctic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Better than average conditions in northern Europe, Alaska, northern Siberia, but drier than average over the Amazon forest. This is just to give you an overview of things outside the UK, but I'll come to the UK in a minute. High precipitation levels and so on. Of course, the effects, if you like, I don't have to, it's been repeated several times. People will be exposed to those effects of climate hazards and agriculture and so on. So it's not just one area, it is going to affect quite a lot. Not just flooding, obviously, we're talking about dry spells, we are talking about wildfires and several things, heat stress being another one. The figure on the left is again from the UK Climate Change Committee's report. It's just to put things in perspective from a cost perspective in terms of what the potential earnings that could be lost due to heat exposure. Of course the report gets into details of various other hazards as well, but I just thought it'll be helpful to put that in perspective. Of course, there are peaks here, but what is consistent, or what is, although it goes up and down, what is consistent is between decades there does seem to be a pattern, right? So that is something we can't ignore. So it's not like something is going to happen at the end of the century, but seems like it's now, and we need to start preparing. Well, we have already lost time, but better get better prepared is probably the message I'll take from that. In terms of progress, again, there's plenty that's happening out there, so I wouldn't have time to get everything on one, and I'm sure the other speakers will get into the details. But I just thought just highlights, and this is something some of you might already know, that the Paris Agreement Article 7 specifically established the global goal on adaptation, and the items in blue is something I wanted to highlight um, because of how the word adaptation and resilience is sometimes interchangeably used. So adaptation means it's enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. All of the three to reduce, to respond to climate change. So that's something important to bear in mind when we talk about the topic of adaptation. In terms of energy transition, which is the other side, like the climate mitigation side of the coin, that's also equally important because that has a bearing on at least, if not reducing or trying reducing the warming effect, at least trying to contain it. Clean fuels versus fossil fuels. There are some good news that you might have seen on BBC, Guardian, and so on last week. I think the Ember report that the coal production has displaced renewables. It's a very modest figure, like 0.3% drop of fossil fuel generation, but it's been dubbed as a good start. It's a start. This is for the 2025. Renewable energy generation has increased, and there is evidence that it has displaced coal generation or coal as a fuel for electricity generation for the first half of 2025. But what is interesting is that it's the East or China and India and other countries that are the main contributors. And in the West, especially with the US and EU, we've gone or used more fossil fuels owing for two reasons. In the US, it's just because the electricity demand was so high that the renewable energy couldn't meet that demand. That was not enough to meet the demand. That was one. And in the EU, it was more to do with weaker wind and hydro output that has led to fossil fuel or use of fossil fuel for electricity generation. So it's a clear story to consider clean energy production alongside energy demand reduction. That is what it is at this point. So it's not about only renewable energy generation, but it is also about reducing our energy demand so that it commensurates with what's been produced. And the other thing I wanted to highlight was how, in terms of progress, this is still happening. It's not there yet, but it is something worth noting is the sustainability reporting standards. The European sustainability reporting standards, obviously it's in existence now, particularly the IFRS S2, which talks about which does focus on climate risks and taking a climate first approach. But that's a sort of approach that the UK standards, which is now being written and expected by the end of early next year, and that is also taking a climate first approach. Obviously, the SRS, the reporting standards, they apply to businesses or relevant businesses, but it is a good start, and there are so many things that we could pick from there and bring it in different contexts. I think there is that opportunity. The last bottom right figure is just to highlight how climate adaptation, there's a case for climate adaptation, and the figure there, it just shows how the heat stress or the reason for energy demand, electricity demand rise was owing to heat or extreme heat. Obviously, you switch on AC or fans and so on. But there is where climate adaptation and nature-based solutions, for example, is a good fit there. I mean, think about using nature as a shade, for example, or go for more shading. I'm getting into the adaptation solution side of things, but what I'm trying to say here is they're all interconnected, and it is like that whole holistic thinking that's needed when somebody is looking at climate adaptation in general. Right then, moving on to what the opportunities and challenges are. This is my last slide. Just wanted to put some figures out there. In terms of challenges, the top left, 1.3 trillion US dollars would be is what the parties, so the conference of parties, are hoping to target or to amass by the end of 2035 for climate adaptation or financing climate adaptation. But it was only 300 billion that was committed the last COP. We'll wait to find out what happens at this year. So that's one. And the other big thing to highlight or a challenge is, as Joseph had started with, only 10% of adaptation finance. Uh, Only 10% of climate investments forms part of adaptation finance. And pretty much most of that is around mitigation investments. And that seemed to be attractive, probably because it's possible to quantify and define and make a case for investments when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, because it's quite mature there. And it also may be because of financial returns from mitigation projects like solar or such, that could be a bit more attractive for investors compared to adaptation benefits, which is pretty long term and sometimes maybe not articulated in monetary terms very well, or in a figure that is easy for people to understand. That's one view. And then and also additionally, nations also favor international mitigation investments, but I hope that position changes with this COP and going forward. Another drawback or challenge, if you like, is around data, and this is more for developing countries and those, which is around climate knowledge gap and lack of localized risk assessments in developing countries. That was a finding for UNDP, and that is a big challenge, because if you don't know what the risks are, if that information doesn't exist to understand what the risks are, and the rest of the adaptation planning cycle, it's going to be tricky. And so that's one big area to or to a gap area to address. And in terms of coming to the UK, we're at home. Again, referring back to the Climate Change Committee's report itself, the progress in adaptation. So the report's name is Progress in Adapting to Climate Change, which was released 2025. It did, with just one example, there are so many data and so much information there, and it is, I mean, you can't get a report as more straight and like, in your face type. You guys got to do. I mean, the government needs to do something about this. That is what, in a short sentence, I would say. But it's a great report to read. But one thing is, in summer 2022, when the heat wave struck and wildfires happened, 500% increase. There was a 500% increase in 999 like emergency calls, and that led to it being declared as a major event. And that just says what is the ability to cope, and the resilience picture, right? So here's where I'm talking about adaptation. Is for adaptation, it's not just adapting or or building structures or making arrangements to cope with what might come, but it's also after the event has happened, how we rebound, how we get back to what is normal, what was there before. That's very important, and that's what pretty much that figure helps explain. So, and also the last thing is the socioeconomic impact of the and the cost of climate change without any intervention could be in the region of 7% of the GDP by 2050 for the UK. It just tells how important it is. And that is a clear case for reducing vulnerability and enhancing adaptive capacity of the system. What I would like to add to this is to see inclusion as in inclusion of vulnerable groups, thinking about equality groups like gender, disability, and so far, and so that they don't fall through the gaps. When you think about climate adaptation, how do we make sure that they are integrated? Of course, the framework, the UN framework, UAE Belém framework does talk about that, and we're yet to see what that looks like when the indicator, which the adaptation measures indicator that's going to be released at this COP is going to show. But that's something I'm really keen to see. It's important that those sorts of equality and just like just transition and energy transition is a key or fundamental element. It's important to think about vulnerable groups and make sure that they are part of the thinking process when it comes to understanding risks, understanding current risks and future risks, as well as identifying and prioritizing those actions. And in terms of resilience, the strengthening the resilience and adaptation is very important. How to bounce back, as I said, was in the case of the summer 2022 events. Some positive examples, they exist in the form of environment agency programs here in the UK, like funds for coastal transition accelerator program and so on, as well as flood RE, which is a joint industry and government initiative around it's a flood reinsurance scheme that provides reinsurance to promote affordable and available affordable insurance for UK households which might be present or which might be located in high flood risk areas. What is important is okay, these nuggets are good ideas exist, but while this is positive, but thinking about cost as a cost factor to identifying risks, and that's important, I think, in the adaptation cycle. That's my third point, which was going to be around thinking about cost, even if it is like a basic analysis. It need not be a business case analysis. Even basics understanding of costs is important, because then that helps people appreciate what the cost might be, what would be the future cost of not having an action or not taking an action. Those are the sorts of things I think, and also to articulate and try to think about funds, for example, to then have an argument around how risk insurance, for example, could then come into the play and change things. Those sorts of conversations are possible, but it's important that we start thinking about, as well as, and I think this is important for environment professionals as well, to okay, qualitative and environmental side of things is one, as well as people side of things as one. But the more we start teaching ourselves how to articulate that in monetary terms, I think is important. It's not, and finally, it's having an appreciation of the cost and turning that risk, so that the risk doesn't turn into an issue, is very important. And it's appreciable that not everything can be monetized, but not monetizing risks also can be a risky business, is what I think. Just to cover my whole opportunity areas here and the points, climate mitigation and adaptation are not mutually exclusive, and that greater mitigation will reduce or at least not add further adaptation costs. But when thinking about adaptation plans and so on, it's important to consider vulnerable groups. And when I say consider, the place where they should probably sit is within the monitoring indicators. So it'll naturally drive that thinking process. That's one area, which is an opportunity area. Again, as I said, cost, thinking about cost or evaluation of climate risk in that context, however small it might be, however non-detailed it might be, it's still beneficial. And then thinking about resilience as an integral part of climate analysis, not just thinking about emergency services, but community resilience and so on as an integral part of climate adaptation planning. Is those are the 3 points, I think, in terms of opportunities. Converting challenges into opportunities areas, I thought might be good, something to present here, and I'm hoping that we will discuss this today. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Kripa. It was a fantastic introduction to the discussion. I think you gave us a great perspective on where we are now from that global level data from be it the World Climate Research Programme, the World Met Organization, to what that actually means in terms of practical challenges and opportunities. And I found that framing earlier in your presentation particularly useful, that this is happening now, not at the end of the century. And it's happening here, it's happening everywhere, not some other place like the North Pole, like it's only an issue for polar bears. Is really important to this conversation about adaptation and how we push forward urgent action and make that case for climate adaptation. Our next speaker is going to be Shan Sheng. Over to you.
Thank you, Kripa, for setting the scene from a global perspective, as well as many interesting, very important facts. So my presentation on this would be probably more in the UK context, and as well as looking at some drivers and some of the what we can do to adapt in terms of principles and so on. So the key drivers, actually increasingly the extreme weather events and so on, which Kripa already covered. I'm not going to too much details on that, but the economic damage as well as health damage is enormous. So we all experienced actually in the UK ourselves, such as heat waves a couple of years ago, as well as recent as this year. So looking at another key driver, I think, is legislation. Obviously, UK government is legal bounded to address national climate adaptation risks. They are required to release a report called UK Climate Change Risk Assessment every 5 years, which plans how they are going to address the climate issue. This can affect infrastructure projects based on the outcomes, such as commitment to invest more in flood defense, for example, as well as the EIA regulation mandate the project to assess the impact of the proposed project on climate. For example, the nature and the magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions and the vulnerability of the project to climate change. With an upward trend also in standard climate change EIA chapters, as well as national planning policy framework, and has been updated, has increased emphasis on climate resilience into planning. In addition to that, local authorities have their standalone planning requirements projects needs to abide by. Many of those now require climate change risk and adaptation plan as part of the documentation for submission. So when we're looking at the principle of climate resilience and adaptation, I think I will probably briefly just to mention the interactive process that should be carried out. So first step, normally we're looking at climate modeling in terms of utilize the Met Office projections, the Environment Agency flood maps identify the climate hazards and conditions. And the second step, we will be looking at identify key receptors and their specific vulnerabilities and the risk to the climate hazard. So the third step, normally when you develop adaptation measures, you need to consider whether they are practical, whether they are proportionate to the project or the business, whether they are economical. Prioritize those measures, actually being able to assess which one need to be done now and which one can be done later. So that's need to be integrated into design, operational plan, and the policies. The first step is actually adaptive management. Is evaluate and monitor the outcome, implement the adaptive management to proactively adapt to the evolving climate risk, and allow adjustment in your planning. So in terms of key reporting mechanism for assessing climate adaptation risk, so if a local authority has specific requirements or a specific project or business might have assets which are high risk due to their nature, location, or significance, then a full climate change risk assessment can be carried out. Those can be part of the EA as well as a standalone. And adaptation plan can follow on that to provide long-term and short-term plans fit into project, business risk, and investment planning as well. So in principle, what can you do on your project to adapt? I think one of the very key consideration is really factor this in early in the project. Understand all the legislative and policy requirements so you can scope in the full extent of the consideration early. And secondly, it's really important to collaborate your teams and communicate with clients why you should improve on climate adaptation. And thirdly, remember, adaptive measures need to be practical, proportionate, cost-effective, and impact-driven. So measures need to be really bespoke for different sectors. Flood defense, heat resistance building design, considering climate projections in design specifications, all matters. It's not just looking at past climate data. And very importantly, nature-based solution will see your core benefit in terms of on the project, either socially or environmentally or both. So you need to embed climate considerations. So in a nutshell, embed it into design policies and make it a business as usual for the project to adapt. So I just give you a quick example of one of the projects we're working on. It's a flood defense scheme in the UK. It is one of the largest to date. It's looking at to reduce flood risk for 15,000 properties. So we were actually working on looking at climate change risk assessment as well as looking at the greenhouse gas assessment, carbon, and so on. So one of the principles is to utilize PASS 2080 and looking at solutions, recommendations, how to develop longer-term adaptation plan to create the value for the wider community. So some of the recommendations, for example, looking at sequencing of construction work to enable safer flood response management, and also consider climate projections in the design standards as well, and establish, for example, early warning system, also looking at sustainable urban drainage system and nature-based solutions as well. So all these things need to really considered in an integrated manner throughout the life cycle of any scheme. So we tend to talking about mitigation quite a lot. Mitigation is looking at reduce particularly carbon emissions, make sure a reduction of the vulnerability. But I think one of the important takeaway is that adaptation actions and the mitigation really need to work together. So I think you can see probably from our speaker, like Kripa, as well as what we looking at today, the time to taking actions on climate change, resilience, adaptation, mitigation, and reporting, all this together is actually quite urgent. It is now. I hope we also be able to see those areas all need to work together actually in order to reduce and manage risk that organizations as well as projects we are facing now as quick as possible. So I probably will stop there. By all means, actually we can discuss further, and I leave my contact details here as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean, for that great presentation. As you said, giving us that UK specific perspective, I think really complemented what we heard from Kripa. At the IS, I mean, we always love to view the challenges from a systems perspective. So I thought your perspective on drivers was really helpful to understanding these issues from that big systems perspective as well, and how we can start cracking into the complexity so that we can imagine ways that we can make a meaningful difference on this. And I also think that practical perspective, starting from your principles of resilience, those process-based insights, and that case study, really helpful for professionals working on these issues. A lot of the time, we think that these big summits are the only way to make change, but actually, real progress is often going to rely on this kind of action in the roots of implementation. So, I think that perspective is absolutely really critical to understanding. Yeah, so Denise, over to you.
So, good day, everyone. My name is Denise Opala, and as Joseph rightfully said, I'm a marine scientist in Nigeria, and I work for the Economic Community of West African States, where I've worked for, a bit close to 15 years. So, my talk today is going to be really short. It's basically on adapting to 1.5 degrees, but in a marine and with the marine and coastal perspective. So some of the topics I'll be talking about are understanding the impacts of this increase, the role COP30 has to play, some recommendations, and just a few concluding thoughts, including the Turning the Tide project implemented by the IES. So the significance of this is that, the climate crisis is increasingly impacting our oceans, the coasts, and including people that live Nigeria is a coastal country, and it's greatly impacted. We have a lot of indigenous people that climate change and increase in temperature has greatly impacted the lives of a lot of people, which we have witnessed firsthand. So this is a very crucial and timely topic. So the first impact, of course, is the rising temperature. So global temperatures are projected to rise and significantly affecting marine biodiversity. For example, our coral reefs are experiencing mass bleaching events leading to widespread loss of marine life as a whole. And these elevated temperatures also trigger marine heat waves. And such acute thermal increases can also overwhelm the adaptive capacities of marine organisms, leading to overall reduced ecological performance. Another impact is sea level rise. So coastal areas are greatly at risk, with projections indicating a potential rise of about 1 meter by the year 2100. And this threatens not only the marine ecosystems, but also livelihoods of coastal communities. This escalation in sea levels directly contributes to habitat degradation, diminished biodiversity, and reduced ecosystem services, which are provided by marine environments. The third and the last we're going to talk about is ocean acidification. So increased CO2 levels lead to more acidic oceans, which harm marine organisms, disrupting entire food webs. And this reduced pH diminishes the availability of carbonate ions, which are very crucial for calcifying organisms, thus jeopardizing fundamental marine ecosystems. The process also worsens other stresses such as deoxygenation as well as ocean warming. So what's the role of COP30 in all this? So the COP30 presidency, which is led by Brazil, has adopted the motto, global mutirão against climate change. So a mutirão is a Brazilian term of Tupi Guarani origin that refers to a collective effort by a community to accomplish a common task. So this ethos underscores the imperative for concerted international cooperation and shared responsibility in addressing the complex and interconnected challenges of marine and coastal resilience in a rapidly changing climate. So this collective action is particularly important for marine and coastal ecosystems, which are experiencing a lot of pressure from both global climate change as well as local anthropogenic man-made impacts. So one of the key roles of the COP30 would be to drive deliberations on funding mechanisms. So adequate funding, as we all know, is crucial for supporting local adaptation initiatives, particularly in regions which are most vulnerable to climate impacts, including our less developed countries and our developing countries. So, and this requires a substantial increase in public funding for adaptation, resilience, and biodiversity protection, alongside innovative financial mechanisms which will support marine recovery. Also, the involvement of private sector investment facilitated through clear regulatory frameworks and incentives can also play a very significant role in supporting these efforts. So the third is international collaboration by strengthening global partnerships. So strengthening global partnerships among nations, not-for-profit organizations and local communities is very important for not only for knowledge sharing, but also for resource mobilization, as this collaborative paradigm must integrate scientific findings, but not only scientific findings, but also indigenous and local knowledge in order to formulate a holistic and culturally relevant strategy for climate change adaptation and mitigation. So some recommendations for COP30 in this respect would be to integrate scientific insights. That's by leveraging scientific research to inform adaptable policies. These policies should integrate interdisciplinary knowledge, as mentioned before, including social sciences and traditional ecological knowledge, in order to create a comprehensive context-specific strategy. Also enhancing collaboration by fostering partnerships among stakeholders in marine conservation, policymaking, and community engagement. Sorry, I moved the slides by mistake. So the last role for recommendation for COP30 would be to focus on implementation. It's one thing to have all these on paper, it's another thing to actually put it into action. So ensuring that research translates to actionable policies which benefit both ecosystems and coastal communities is very important. And this will involve robust implementation guidelines and fostering the necessary institutional capacity to translate scientific insights to tangible on-the-ground interventions. So a few concluding thoughts. So as we face the realities of climate change, adapting to 1.5 degrees Celsius is not just an environmental issue. It's also a social justice issue for coastal communities. Therefore, COP30 must prioritize equitable adaptation strategies which safeguard vulnerable populations and address historical injustices in resource allocation and environmental degradation. So COP30 presents a critical moment to prioritize marine adaptation strategies to safeguard our oceans and coastal livelihoods. So a bit about the Turning the Tide project, the systems thinking for a sustainable ocean. It was launched in 2023 and it was a long-term project covering 4 themes in marine and coastal science from a systems thinking perspective. So those 4 themes were bridging the gap between land and sea, which explores the connections between marine and coastal ecosystems and land-based activities. Also, the blue carbon theme, which examines the critical role of coastal ecosystems in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Then we also have the blue economy theme, which focuses on how a sustainable blue economy can be developed to protect the marine environment while also supporting economic activities such as fisheries, aquaculture, and transportation. The 4th and the last theme is marine conservation and restoration, which explores opportunities and challenges involved in the conservation and restoration of marine and coastal ecosystems. So this project was endorsed by the UN Ocean Decade, which is an initiative that running between 2021 and 2030, as many of us know. So thank you.
No, thank you, Denise. That was brilliant. We always love an IES project shout out. I think the work that the marine and coastal science community and Joe and Amy from the team did on Turning the Tide was really top notch. Great to get that perspective from marine and coastal science in general, though, which I think is absolutely essential to this discussion, particularly if we think that our traditional approach to resilience is often at odds with the way that natural systems like marine ecosystems actually work. And I really appreciated that breakdown of the impacts, how they're affecting both the marine ecosystems, but also people and coastal communities. And thank you also for bringing us back to that framing of Mutalal, because the idea of global cooperation and shared responsibility is really important to the adaptation agenda, especially, as you say, when costs, challenges, and vulnerabilities are not always equally distributed. So thank you. And our final speaker is going to be Craig Love. Craig, over to you.
Thank you so much. Afternoon, I'm Craig Love. I'm Director of Impact Assessment and Environment at the Scottish National Investment Bank, and I'm really thankful to the IES for allowing me to come along today and talk about climate change adaptation. So ahead of COP, the reality is that we're facing a likelihood of the world reaching 1.5 degrees warming, which marks a critical juncture in the global climate narrative. This threshold, long considered key to limiting and avoiding the most severe impacts of climate change, is not only at risk, but likely to be exceeded due to continued greenhouse gas emissions and insufficient mitigation efforts. Even if this was only a temporary overshoot, it would accelerate the frequency and intensity of weather extremes, disrupt ecosystems, and disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. While crossing 1.5 degrees doesn't mean it's too late to act, it underscores the urgency for transformative policies, rapid decarbonisation, and global cooperation to limit warming and build resilience. This threshold is not a cliff edge, but marks a shift in scale and urgency of adaptation, particularly as climate impacts are already intensifying, with pushing some systems closer to irreversible tipping points, which could trigger cascading and long-lasting changes. So we're already seeing climate change driving more frequent and severe impacts and shocks, from extreme heat waves and floods to prolonged droughts, creating cascading risks across interconnected systems such as food, water, health, and infrastructure. These disruptions amplify vulnerabilities, hitting marginalized communities hardest and deepening existing inequalities. As the impacts intensify and the limits of adaptation are becoming increasingly visible, some ecosystems and human systems may be unable to cope with even with significant resilience measures. This emerging reality underscores the urgency for transformative action to reduce emissions and strengthen adaptive capacity before critical thresholds are crossed. Now, there are 5 key resilience challenges: urban resilience, food systems, water security, health systems, and nature and biodiversity. As the effects of a changing climate come to fruition, cities will become increasingly vulnerable to heat stress, flooding, and mounting pressures in critical infrastructure, challenging their ability to maintain essential services. At the same time, food systems face declining crop yields and disrupted supply chains, threatening global food security. The strain on water could intensify with droughts and flooding, compromising both the availability and quality. Health systems will need to contend with rising disease burdens and heat-related mortality. Meanwhile, nature and biodiversity, which are already approaching tipping points, will see ecosystems struggling to adapt to accelerating climate change. Together, these interconnected risks highlight the urgent need for integrated resilience strategies across all sectors. Significant adaptation gaps persist across multiple dimensions, most notably finance, data and planning, implementation, and inclusivity. Finance remains a major constraint, with adaptation efforts receiving only about 15 to 20% of total climate finance, far short of what is needed. The UNEP's 2024 adaptation gap estimated that adaptation finance gap is circa 187 to 359 billion US dollars per year, which suggests public budgets will not be enough to address the adaptation challenge alone. Even where, many countries also lack robust climate risk assessments and forward-looking planning, leaving them unprepared for escalating hazards. Even where adaptation plans exist, implementation is often slow and fragmented or underfunded, limiting real-world impacts. Moreover, equity considerations are critical. Adaptation must be locally led, inclusive, and just to ensure that vulnerable communities are not left behind in the transition to resilience. So, what needs to happen at COP? At COP, the global community must turn ambition into action by advancing the goal on adaptation from the high-level frameworks to measurable, time-bound progress. Delivering on the promises made at COP26 to double adaptation finance is essential to close the funding gap and enable vulnerable nations to build resilience. Equally critical is operationalising the Loss and Damage Fund so that it provides timely, accessible support for recovery and adaptation. Scaling up early warning systems will ensure that all communities have access to life-saving climate risk information. Embedding nature-based solutions into adaptation strategies will strengthen ecosystems and deliver co-benefits for people and biodiversity. Together, these steps are vital to safeguarding lives, livelihoods, and natural systems in an era of escalating climate risks. Brazil's presidency offers a unique opportunity to spotlight Amazon resilience, elevate indigenous leadership, and strengthen South-South cooperation pillars of global climate action. Linking adaptation and with mitigation will be critical. For example, by promoting resilient, renewable energy systems that withstand climate shocks while also reducing emissions. The private sector must also play a central role through enhanced risk disclosure, building resilient supply chains, and driving insurance and innovation to manage escalating climate risks. Equally important is amplifying youth and local voices, ensuring that they shape decisions, drive accountability, innovation, and equity in the transition to a climate resilient future. While COP conferences play a vital role in raising global awareness on climate change, adaptation is a long-term endeavour that cannot be confined to annual negotiations. To make real progress, we need sustained year-round action that bridges the gap between commitments and implementation. This requires strong cross-sector collaboration, aligning governments, businesses, and civil society to deliver integrated solutions. Policy coherence is essential to avoid fragmented efforts and ensure adaptation is embedded across development, energy, and economic strategies. Above all, empowering communities to lead and shape adaptation measures will be critical for building resilience that is inclusive, locally relevant, and sustainable. Adapting to a world that has warmed beyond 1.5 degrees is not about clinging to survival. It's about reimagining and transforming the systems that sustain life so they can thrive under the new realities. This means building cities that are cooler, greener, food systems that are resilient and equitable, and economies that prioritize sustainability over short-term gain. It calls for innovation, collaboration, and bold leadership that turns climate risks into opportunities for regeneration and growth. Now, by embracing the need to change, we can create a future where communities are not just protected from the impacts of climate change, but feel empowered to flourish in harmony with nature. And that's my last slide. Thank you, Joseph.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig. I think that's absolutely wonderful presentation. I particularly like that final thought on embracing the need for change because, I mean, when we think about it, change is here, change is coming regardless, and it's a choice about the kind of change that we want, isn't it? And I love that framing of it. I also liked your point about temporary overshoot because it really underlines a crucial issue here about tipping points and cumulative effects because it's really important to communicating adaptation that we understand that this isn't something that we can just come back to later. It is really imperative right now. And yeah, the call for transformative action. Great to get a view on those gaps because I think that aligns really well with Sian's view on drivers as well. So at this stage, a massive thank you again to all of our speakers for those insightful presentations. These conversations will be continuing over the coming weeks. And if you're interested in getting involved in the wider work of the IES related to climate action, please do consider joining our climate action community, or indeed our marine and coastal science community, or our environmental policy implementation community, all of which are relevant to this discussion. We have another discussion coming up in our Road to COP30 event series next week on 16th of October. We'll turn our attention to the issue of delivering solutions and how we can move from ambition to action on this critical agenda, not just for climate mitigation, but also for what we've discussed today in terms of adaptation. That event is free to attend, just like this one, so you can sign up right now on the IES website. For now, thank you again for all of you for attending, participating, and sharing your views and questions. But thank you especially to Kripa, Sian, Denise, and Craig for setting us up so well by sharing your expertise and for such great presentations. Everything that we've discussed today will help to inform our work ahead of COP30. As I mentioned, the outcomes of these discussions will be brought together in a position piece, which will be used to brief the IES delegate attending COP30 and inform our wider work on climate change. There'll be more information on that ahead of COP30 and shortly afterwards. For now, though, that is it from us for today. So thank you to everyone for logging in and participating. I hope you found it beneficial and informative. If you're an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar in our CPD tool by logging into the IES members area. And if you're not already an IES member, but you've enjoyed today's discussion, please do consider joining or becoming an affiliate because it's the best way to support our science-led action on climate change and to gain the benefits of IES membership. For now, thank you again to Kripa, Sian, Denise, and Craig. And thank you to everyone for attending and for taking part. Hopefully, we'll see you all again soon.